Alright, so what we're going to do is I'm going to take you through the process of designing a sound in the Subtractor. Alright, so what I've got here is just simply a subtractor. You'll notice that I have a mixer up here, but it's collapsed, and I've used these arrows to collapse it so that I don't need to see it. This is the line mixer. It's a basic 6-channel mixer with just one send and return. And then I've collapsed it because we don't really need to see it. This is a lot easier to use when you're just dealing with a couple of instruments and you're not doing a full mix. Okay. I've also collapsed the hardware device. There's no reason for us to see that, and actually most of the time we can go ahead and collapse that. Alright, so here's our subtractor. Let's go ahead and start out by right-clicking and initializing the patch. Okay, and so we do that, and then so now we're set up with our basic sawtooth sound. Okay, let's go ahead and open up the filter wide open so we can hear what that. Okay, so there's our basic sawtooth sound, the default envelope, and so on and so forth. So what we're going to do is we're going to design the look for the classic brass synthesizer patch. Now, as I told you before, we're not trying to really imitate a synthesizer. We're actually looking for something that I consider to be a stylized brass sound. So we're not trying to capture realism by any stretch of the imagination. So, you know, think of an impressionist painting or a cubist painting, something that resembles the actual thing, but is in fact different and just as beautiful, but just different. So we'll borrow many of the characteristics from a brass sound, but we're not going to actually try to create, you know, a trumpet or a trombone per se. Okay. Now, so the first thing that we need to think about is what exactly does a trumpet or a brass instrument sound like? And to me, it's kind of a rather bright sound. It's kind of buzzy. And so of the 4 waveforms, the most likely waveform to use is going to be a sawtooth wave. Okay. Now, of course, that doesn't sound like brass at all. We've got some work to do on that. Now, one other option, though, that you might want to consider is over here. We haven't talked about this, but this is the phase controls. Now, what the phase controls do is that they can make it so that we can create a pulse wave. Now, we do have a square wave here, and the square wave is one type of pulse wave, and what that square wave is has a relationship of 1-to-1 positive and negative signal. Okay, a pulse wave varies that ratio. It doesn't necessarily have, it could be 2-to-1, it could be 3-to-1, it could be 1-to-3. So it can be any variation, and when you do that, it creates a different sound with a little bit more character to it. Surprisingly, though, it doesn't work well with the square wave. It really works with the sawtooth wave. So if we change this now, we have 2 modes. We can multiply them, the two, and so, or we can subtract them. And what this does is it essentially uses 2 waveforms. And it puts them together, does the math to put them together either as multiplied or subtracting them, and creates a sound. So if we listen to the sawtooth wave by itself, kind of sounds like that. Okay? But now if we subtract the wave, you can see it's a little brighter. And then we can multiply it, and it's quite a bit brighter. But we can also control then the pulse. We can which is also called the duty cycle. The ratio is the duty cycle. And so if we push that up, and you can see now we've turned this almost, by multiplying them together, we turn it almost into it. Almost. Okay, so you can hear both of those. That's a pretty interesting sound too, but it's probably not much use for a brass. And I find these a little too bright. I'm not so sure I like that. And then the sing. Now, of course, if we subtract two waveforms and put them 100%, put them perfectly in phase and subtract them, we get nothing, which is why this is sounding nothing. And now we have a square wave. So here we are now somewhere in between. Okay, I think for right now, let's go ahead and start with the sawtooth wave. And then the next step, of course, is in our spectral characteristics, or the frequency of this, is to then shape it some with the filter. And so we have to remove some of the sounds, since this is subtractive synthesis. Okay, maybe a little bit more. All right, so there's kind of the basic. Now I'm sure you're listening to that and saying that doesn't sound like brass at all. Well, of course it doesn't, because we haven't done any shaping to it. All we've done now is we've basically taking our lump of clay here, and we've more or less put it into kind of the basic kind of shape that we want to start to work with, but we really have to do some work to it now to start to add some detail. First place we should probably start is over here at the amp envelope. If I think about the way a trumpet or trombone sounds, they take just a little bit time to speak, so we'll push this attack up just a little bit. Okay, they're not quite so percussive a sound. And let's see, our decay. Well, I think we need a sustain level a little higher than that. Maybe even a little higher. And then probably our release should just be a little softer than nothing. Yeah, so it doesn't stop abruptly, it just kind of stops. Okay. All right, so now we're getting a little closer there, but it's still not quite right. Okay. And where we can, so the next step that I'm going to look at is working with this filter, because the filter really to me is the shaper of the sound. It's not so much the amplitude here, but the filter itself that will give us our. And where we shape this, we need to modulate the filter some way. And there's a couple of places we could modulate it with an LFO, but that's probably not what we're looking for. Instead, we're going to be looking at the filter envelope, and that's really the most important area. So let's try pushing this attack up. Okay, and so that works kind of nicely. Okay, and we might want to push our decay up just a little bit too. Maybe that's a little too far. Okay. And then we're going to boost the amount also here. Yeah, now the reason that was happening now I just realized is that I have my filter velocity on, and that shouldn't have been. There we go now. Okay, so now we have kind of a little wah, little on the attack. We've just added some character to the attack of that. I think we can probably push that just a little bit more. Okay, make that decay take just a little longer. And let's see what happens if we push the sustain level up. I think that's a little too high, but I kind of like that idea there. Because we don't want it to get too dark after that. Now if we once we push that up a little bit, might even push the amount a little bit more, we might try pulling down the filter. Okay, that's a little friendlier sound. I kind of like that. By just pulling that cutoff frequency down a little bit, it changes how much this, or what this effect creates for us here. But that just gives us a little friendlier sound. Let's see what happens if we add a little bit of resonance to it. Now resonance will increase the sounds around the cutoff frequency, and remember the cutoff frequency is moving a little bit here, so the resonance will have a little bit of an effect there too. That's a little too sounding. So see, but just a little bit. Here, listen to it without it. Gives it just a little bit more characteristic there. I kind of like that. Yeah, there's kind of a nice brass. So we're doing pretty well here. This sounds kind of like a brass instrument. I'm going to now try to add just a little bit more to it. We could also, might want to experiment with the low pass filter. Maybe use a 4-pole filter. I'm not sure that's going to make a whole lot of difference. In fact, I think I like it better with the 12, with the 2-pole filter. And then I'm also going to boost keyboard tracking. And so what this does is this will adjust the cutoff frequency somewhat based on what pitch I'm playing. So if I'm playing a low pitch, it'll be at one level. Kind of gets a little brighter as we go up. Okay, which is pretty common of brass instruments. If you think of a trombone, it's not as bright as a trumpet. And so that gives us just a little bit of brightness. You have to use quite a bit of that to get that to really have an effect. You know, that's not one that can be real subtle, whereas you notice that we don't use quite as much with the filter envelope. If we push that up too far, we'd have to make some adjustments. The more of this you use, the more subtle you have to be with the actual filter envelope. Let's see, maybe. See, now we would have to have a much faster decay if we're using more amount. But I don't like where that ends up, so I think I'm going to put it back to where it was and pull this down a little bit. Yeah, that sounds just fine. Okay, now I can go ahead and put this the filter envelope from velocity. Velocity is how hard you strike the keys, and that should also affect the brightness of a sound. So we'll push that up a little bit. See, harder. And we could even, let's see what happens when we push it all the way up. See, that doesn't work so well. So just a little bit of that works pretty nicely. I try to keep that down pretty low. There, that's pretty good. All right, now the other thing that's happening, now you listen to the sound and it just sits there. It's kind of static, and we've managed to get some shape into the attack area, which is really what this filter envelope has done. It's shaped the attack of the filter and given us some sound. You see that's changing over time very quickly, but then it just sits there. Okay, so we need to do a little bit something else there, and what we probably want to do is try to add a little bit of vibrato. Now we could do it by using the oscillator. LFO going to the oscillator, and notice I like the LFO2 more than the LFO1, and the main reason is that it has this delay control. The advantage of LFO1 is it has all of these different waveforms, and in an LFO2 you're really just dealing with a triangle wave. So it's just going to things are just going to go up and down, and so if I apply this to apply a lot of it, you're going to hear. Yeah, obviously we don't want to hear something like that. So you have to use very little of this. Maybe that's a little too little. Well, that's not too bad. And then we can put some delay in there so that we actually notice it when it comes in. Okay. Now that's not too bad. So you have to be very subtle if you're going to use vibrato on pitch. A better way to get vibrato in most patches is to modulate the phase. Remember, what we have here is two different waveforms, and if we move this back and forth, you'll hear it. Here, we have to turn it on first. See, so if I move that back and forth, it's going to change things quite a bit. Okay, so if I was using this, almost can deal with that. And then I can add actually quite a bit more of that. And you can hear, and that's a much subtler vibrato. And you can choose the speed, and okay, and so now I'm not sure that I actually like that sound as much. Maybe I do actually. Yeah, we can go with that. Let's try that. Yeah, it's okay. And you know, that's one of the fun things about designing these things. Some days I use my sawtooth waves and I like those sounds better, and other times I use the pulse wave and I like that a little bit better. So it just depends on your mood for the particular day. Alright, so we have the sound. It's not too bad, but since it's going to be a brass ensemble, maybe we can make it just a little bit bigger. And let's go here and now go ahead and turn on oscillator 2. You notice that yes, there's one oscillator and here's another one. Okay. Now if they're set exactly the same way, let's see, what do we have here? 79. All that should happen is that we should in fact double. Okay. By the way, if you need to move these one at a time, hold down the shift key. Okay. Okay, so by putting it all together, what happens is we've doubled the waveform and we've doubled the amplitude, and it's twice as loud. And we have our mix here. Okay, but what we can do is that by putting these together, if we detune them, they will start to get bigger and not louder. Okay, and so let's make that maybe even a little bit more. And that's a pretty nice sound. Had a stuck key there. Okay, now I tend to keep these relatively close to one another. Yeah, that's pretty good. I like that one there. Or at least in multiples. And for whatever reason, I usually move in groups of 3s in the Subtractor. It seems to be a good number to work with. Okay, and now we have a pretty nice little brass ensemble sound.